Picture this scenario. It's your friend's birthday, and so you decide to bake him a cake. So you head over to the grocery store and buy your trusted Betty Crocker cake mix, like this one. And so you go to start baking it. Start by adding your cups of water, you add your vegetable oil, and then you add in your cake mix. And now you've gotten to the final step before actually putting it in the oven. You have to add your eggs. You stop and think for a minute. Wait, do I really need to add these eggs? Or is this cake just a lie? That's exactly what question we proceeded to research today. We started by taking a look about what eggs actually do in a cake to figure out whether they're actually needed or not. And then we designed the experiment. We went ahead and baked cakes with and without eggs and gathered data to see if we can conclude whether eggs were needed or not. And finally, we were able to reflect and analyze what our experiment showed, didn't show, problems that arose within it, to actually conclude whether we needed eggs in it or if the cake was just a lie.
So if you've ever baked a cake, whether it was from scratch or from a cake mix, or actually really baked anything, you'll notice that many of the recipes from either online or from the back of the box, they all call for eggs. But what do eggs actually do in the cakes and brownies and all these things that we bake?
So to start, eggs emulsify some of these liquids that are included within the cake mix. So to start, according to ScienceDirect.com, emulsifying is when you take two immiscible liquids and you combine them together and you get another ingredient that allows them to emulsify, which basically allows them to mix together. So for example, two immiscible liquids would be oil and water. And if I pour this oil on top of the water, as you can see, the oil does not merge with the water, it just sits on top. And what the eggs do is they allow those two liquids to combine.
Next function of eggs in a cake is actually rising in the cake. So Angel, who runs Mom's Baking Co., she said that when you add eggs, when you crack your egg into your cake mix and start mixing it up, lots of air can actually get trapped within the egg yolk. And then so when you go to bake this cake mix, that air can actually expand and it'll cause a bunch of air pockets within your cake. So if you've ever cut open a cake, you see this spongy texture. That is actually what eggs do, and they will rise the cake and they will just add that spongy texture to your cake.
A third main function of eggs in baking is browning the cake. The eggs help to concentrate the heat on the cake batter, and it helps it turn brown in the oven, as well as the yellow color of the yolk, contributing to that golden brown color that you generally like to see in most baked goods.
It's like what Clyde, Jackson, and Michael talked about. Eggs kind of have three functions. You got your emulsifying, you got your rising, you got your browning. What people don't actually know is there's kind of three common ingredients as described by Hudson Kay, a food researcher. And he talked about how there are three main ingredients that actually do these processes in most foods around you. So oftentimes, maybe after this speech you can go and look at, see if you have anything in your house that actually includes these ingredients. It's one of these ingredients, the first one, is something called a distilled monoglyceride. We've actually learned about these in biology this year. And what's so special about these is they can form hydrogen bonds with both water and the oil. So this can actually it can bond with both of these and it causes them to be able to mix together. Next, we got something called cellulose gum. And this can form the same bonds that eggs do, which allows that air to be trapped and for the cake to actually rise. Finally, you have something called sodium stearyl lactate, which is a bit of a mouthful today, but essentially it does the same things that eggs would do, minus the yellow color. It traps that heat, it allows that cake to brown a bit. It doesn't quite add that same amount of color that the eggs do.
So with all of this, since we know that the three main functions of eggs are covered by other ingredients, we hypothesized that eggs aren't really needed in Betty Crocker cake mixes.
So after we figured out our hypothesis, we all set out to bake a cake with eggs and a cake without eggs. So
for this experiment of baking our two cakes, we would need a bunch of materials. So we all decided to settle on a similar type of cake, or a cake mix called Betty Crocker, just really generic cake mix. You can find it basically at any store. And we would need 2 of everything here, except for the eggs, because we're baking one cake with eggs and one without. And so some of the other materials that the recipe called for was a 1/4 cup of water, which would be used twice, one for each cake. 1/2 cup of vegetable oil, which would be used twice, one for each cake again, and then also on the pan to make sure that the cake does not stick. And then finally, we also tried to use each same 13 by 9, which is a standard size for baking pans, so that we could all have comparable cakes.
And then our procedure is very important. Well, it was just as simple as following the directions on the cake box. It actually is really important. Simple thing as maybe slightly too much water or slightly too much time could lead to drastically different results in the cake. So we went ahead and we just followed the instructions of the cake. And for one cake, we did it entirely normal. Nothing different. Word by word, exactly what the box said. And then, at the same time, we baked a second cake. And this time, we did everything the exact same. We just didn't add eggs.
So here I actually have a couple of pictures of our procedure. So here you can see, here's our oil, here's a cake mix, and a bunch of measuring tools. Here we can actually see the cake mix with water, oil, and eggs. And here you can actually see the 2 cake batters. Here's the one with or without eggs and one with eggs in our baking pans before they went into the oven.
So to start, we wanted to see how the structure of the cakes were affected, whether there were eggs present and whether there were not eggs present. So to start, the average height of our cakes that did not include eggs was around 0.7 inches. And the average height of our cakes with eggs was about 1 inch.
So you can see in this image, there's a couple of slices of cake without eggs, a couple of slices with eggs, and the full cakes below. And the cake without eggs, you can see, is much more crumbly, and it's more dense because of the air bubbles not being as trapped because the eggs are missing. It didn't rise quite as much for the same reason. There weren't as many air bubbles. And the reason why the cakes are different without eggs is because even though the main functions of eggs are covered by other ingredients, there's not the eggs there to speed the processes along. The eggs just add a little bit of extra to each of the processes, helping it look like this instead of this with the cracks in the middle.
So after we had our cakes baked, we actually decided to have a kind of a taste test competition between the cake with eggs and with no eggs. So to do this, we just kind of with our family members. We just had them rate each cake. We gave them a slice of each cake, and we had them rate them out of 10. So as you can see, here we have the averages by family member, 1 through 5, because some of us have pretty large families. And so as you can see, for the cake with eggs, the lowest score out of 10 was 5, and the highest was 7. And then for the cake with no eggs, the lowest score was 4, and the highest was 7. Now, as you can see, I mean, 5 to 7 and 4 to 7, those are pretty similar numbers. And in between, you can see almost all of these are 6s. There's 1 5 here, or there's 2 5s here. And then all of these for the no eggs one are actually 6s. So this shows us that, I mean, most people, they're either a very similar range. So most people either like this one or like this one. And this is actually also shown by this data table here. You can see it's almost evenly split with 44.4 and 55.6% people liking the cake with eggs and without eggs. So this shows that there really wasn't much difference with, oh, I like eggs better, I don't like eggs better, or if it was just due to texture or something like that.
So to add on to what Michael said, we can conclude from here that eggs don't really add a lot to taste. And kind of shared with us how the data kind of showed that there wasn't a lot of difference between the tastes. So it's likely it's something down, just like whether you preferred the more crumblier cake without eggs or the more moist cake with eggs. And so this really shows us that eggs' main function is structure, so removing them won't really affect anything in the taste department. It has more has to do with like how much the cake rised, if it's crumbly, and how well it holds together.
Yeah, so next we're going to get into a reflection, and we're really going to look at some of those possible errors that could have been made, and some things that we could maybe do to further our research.
So the first thing we're going to talk about is errors. So as mentioned by Finlay, following our baking procedures is really important, but it's basically impossible to do everything exactly the same 4 times in 4 different houses with 4 different ovens and then 4 different pans and all this. So even small differences like just adding a little bit extra water or a little bit more oil could have definitely changed our results and could have affected how our cakes looked and also how our family members felt about the cakes and how they rated them. Another thing that we kind of figure out that we could have done better is our actual taste test itself. Imagine if I came up to you and told you to eat this cake and it has no eggs in it. that doesn't sound very enticing and could even maybe alter your mind and make you think that, ooh, this cake is not going to taste good. And then once you're in that mindset, once you're eating the cake, you're going to think that it's not good. So if we did actually a blind taste test and didn't tell our family members which cake was which and left it up to only texture and taste for them to choose or rate cakes, then I feel like we could have gotten a lot like more concrete evidence that wasn't as influenced by, oh no, this cake doesn't have eggs and this cake does. And then finally, just as mentioned previously, small things like if I baked this cake on Tuesday when there was a giant rainstorm and it was very humid in the air, whereas if Clyde maybe baked his cake on a very dry day, that could have just affected our overall just structure of the cakes and just done a couple of small changes to the cakes.
So, moving on from that, some ways we could have extended this experiment is, instead of just removing every single egg from the recipe, you could have included just 1 or 2 instead of the recommended 3. This could help determine whether you really need all of the eggs the recipe suggests, or just a couple of them to help with the processes that eggs do. Another thing we could do is find more of the other ingredients that cover the eggs' properties, and add more of them to get that normal cake look.
Okay, so to wrap everything up and kind of take away overall, that it worked without eggs. Our cake baked, and we can kind of say, well, we can bake cake without eggs, but it didn't work to the same extent. You can see that it didn't quite rise as much, or it didn't quite have that same structure held together. So our overall takeaway from this is that you can bake cake without eggs, it just might not be as well. She might recommend only adding 2 eggs or 1 egg. That's something to think about. The next time your friend has a birthday party and you want to go bake your trusted Betty Crocker bake mix for them, and you go through all the steps to bake them, and you get to add eggs. Think about it. Do you really need to add those eggs, or is the cake just a lie? Thank you. Here are some citations.